Morning, everybody. Welcome to the conference and specifically to this plenary session. It's a pleasure for me to coordinate this plenary session. We have two invited speakers. One, and I promise Daniel, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Daniel Mes.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. Who's a Deputy Director for Research and Evaluation at Ofsted. Previously, he was a Professor of Education at the University of Southampton and Associate Dean Research and Enterprise in the Faculty of Social, Human and Mathematical Sciences. He was also previously, he worked as a Professor of Pedagogy and Teacher Development at the University of Manchester, Professor of Leadership and Management at the University of Newcastle, and Senior Lecturer in Quantitative Research Methods at Warwick Institute of Education. He's a quite well-known expert in the fields of educational teacher effectiveness and quantitative research methods, and has published widely in these areas. He is the co-editor of the journal School Effectiveness and School Improvement, and has held key advisory posts in a range of academic and professional organizations, including the Executive Council of the European Association of Research and Learning and Instruction, and the Questionnaire Expert Group for the OECD TALIS survey. Daniel has a PhD in social science from Leuven, the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, an MS in managerial economics, also at the Catholic University of Leuven, and then a BA in communications sciences at the same university. After Daniel, we will listen to Tommaso Agassisti. Tommaso is Professor of Public Management at the Politecnico di Milano. He's a co-director of the Master in School Management and in Managing Digital Innovation in Schools. Both masters are at the same Politecnico, at the Graduate School for Business. He served also as Associate Dean for International Relations in the school. His research interests deal with performance evaluation of public organizations with a specific attention to schools, universities, and local governments. He is also an editor of one important journal. He's an associate editor of the Journal of Higher Education Quarterly and director of the journal Dirigenti Scuola. So we've got, and I'm very happy, as I said previously, we've got the chance to listen and then to discuss with two very good colleagues doing research on the fields we study in this conference and we discuss in this conference. This plenary is going to work the following way. First, we're going to listen to Daniel's presentation. Then we're going to have around 20 minutes for questions and answers. And then we shift to Tommaso's presentation. Given the fact that we start about 8 minutes late, I count on finishing just slightly after 1 p.m. So I hope that will not bother your lunchtime too much, but science is food for thought, so it should not be a problem. And having said this kind of a trivial and obvious sentence, we go to more serious discourses and thoughts from Daniel. Daniel, the floor is yours and welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I will just share with you my presentation. So what I am going to do today is have a look at the use of data for policy and accountability. Obviously, as mentioned, I am based in the UK. So what you will see is that I'm going to use examples that are often from the English context. That's obviously a little bit of a different context, and I will give you hopefully the necessary explanation about the system to make sense of that. The aim of my presentation today is to look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of data use in educational policy and accountability. My presentation will have three main sections. We'll first look at kind of use of primarily national forms of data for policy. Then we will have a look at the use of large-scale international assessments for policy. And finally, we'll have a look at data for accountability. Obviously, as you know, data use is something that is rapidly increasing as a means to inform decision making in society as a whole, as data become both more easily available and collectible, and also more easy to store and analyze. And that's also true in the world of education, though we are, I think it's fair to say that education is probably not right at the forefront of those developments. So let's start with looking at use of data for policy. So when you look at data use for policy, it's first maybe useful to say a little bit about what types of data we are actually looking at here. And that does differ from country to country. One of the things that is kind of typical of education is that it's still very much a national competency. So we are still in a situation where every country has its own systems, which are quite different, and also its own legal frameworks, which are quite different, as we will discuss a little bit more in a moment. So the main types of data that you can see are national assessment data. So that's where we use national examinations as a form of data to inform policy. And that's obviously something that we do quite a lot in England, partly because we have a national assessment system. So we have a testing system. Children are assessed at the end of primary school in the subjects of English, so home language and mathematics. They are then assessed at the age of 16 at the end of compulsory secondary school in a whole range of different subjects. Those are the general certificate of secondary education examinations, national standardized tests. Pupils typically sit between 8 and 12 of those exams. They have a choice which subjects they take, though always they take English and mathematics. And then there are further examinations at the end of what we call A levels. That is for those pupils who are intending to go on to university education. They then sit for 2 years between ages 16 and 18, 3 subjects, and they take exams of those at the end of A level. So that system has existed already for more than 25 years. So we have a lot of data collected. We also have a specific system of storing that data. So every pupil has what we call a unique pupil number that allows you to link the data from the different assessments, primary, secondary, and so on, over time. And it also allows you to connect to a range of other data, for example, what school do they go to, and so on. So that's obviously a very valuable source of data for us. Alongside the assessment data, we also collect a range of other data on pupils. For example, things like their gender, age, what examinations they have sat, the school they go to, but also some demographic characteristics like their ethnicity, like their level of poverty, and so on. So England, in that sense, is quite data rich from a policy perspective. That is not, of course, the case everywhere. So some countries do not have national assessment data, for example. I am from a background from Belgium, and Belgium does not have a national assessment system like this. So they have to rely on samples instead. Also, in terms of the kind of demographic data you can collect from pupils, that also differs. So in England, for example, we collect data on the ethnic background of pupils. In France, that is illegal, so they do not collect that type of data. So what data you have obviously determines to an extent what you can and cannot do. Also, of course, and I'll talk about that a bit later, there are the large-scale international student assessments, which are also used for national policy making in many countries. So why is this data so useful? So the national assessment data allows us to do a number of things, and I'm going to give you some examples of that in a moment. Firstly, it allows us to look at trends over time. So some caveats to that, but in principle, what it should allow us to do is to assess whether or not attainment in our education system as a whole is improving, staying the same, going backwards. An example of where that is done is the United States. They do not have national assessments, but what they have is a sample study called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP. That is held every year, and that is age standardized across years. So what they use the NAEP for is things like looking at, are the overall standards of children in America improving, are gaps between, say, black children and white children decreasing, and so on. So looking at trends over time, obviously, is very valuable. Also, what this data allows us to do is to see whether there are specific gaps or problems. So are there, for example, specific groups who are suffering from underperformance, and also allows us to look at regional differences. So are there differences in performance in different areas? So it's really, really valuable to have this kind of data for policy. Some examples of how we can use that here. So this is, so in England, all this data is publicly available. So you can, as a researcher, get access to this data and use it to do your own analysis. You do have to go through a process of requesting it, and obviously we have to be GDPR compliant and ethics compliant and all those different things as you would expect. But here's an example of an organization that has used the national assessment data, the Education Policy Institute. As the name suggests, they are an organization that aims to influence policy making. And what they have done is they have looked at the gap between disadvantaged pupils in socioeconomic terms and more advantaged pupils. And the indicator they have used for that is eligibility for free school meals. That is a measure of disadvantage within the English education system. And basically it is based on the question, are the pupils' parents or carers under a particular income threshold, which means they can get a free lunch at their school. The pupils can get free lunch at their school. So that is a measure of poverty. What you can see here is already quite useful. So the first thing you can see in the graph to the left of your screen is that though we often say that disadvantage is baked in the earliest years, you can actually see that within the English system, at least, the gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged pupils increases over time. So you can see that the gap is greatest in secondary schools. So what that means is that while obviously it's going to be important to intervene in the early years, this suggests that we need to continue to intervene in primary, continue to intervene in secondary. What we also see from these graphs, especially if we look then at the one on the right, is that the more persistent our disadvantage is, the greater the gap is. So on the left, we see the gap between pupils who have been, whose family has been poor enough to be eligible for a free meal anytime in the last 6 years. On the right, we see pupils who are disadvantaged for at least 80% of the last 6 years. And you can see that the more persistent the disadvantage, you have a greater impact. So again, that is useful for policy. You will see there that in early years, it says not applicable. Well, that is simply because there is not enough data at that age group to say. So that's an example of the kind of things we can do with data and that we can support policy with. It also illustrates a little bit one of the limitations, of course, of data, which is that you only have the variables that you have. What do I mean with that? we here use the measure of being eligible for a free meal as our indicator of poverty or disadvantage. But that is a measure that's based on parental income threshold, so it is a limited measure. It's a binary measure. You are above or below that threshold. It doesn't distinguish between different levels of poverty or disadvantage, etc. So it is a reasonably good proxy for poverty, but it is not a good proxy measure for social class, for which it is sometimes also used. So that's one example of the value of this kind of data for policy. Next one is here. I talked a bit earlier about this issue of different ethnic groups. And again, we can look at the data and see whether particular groups are underperforming compared to others. And we can see here, for example, I know the lists are quite small, that groups that are underperforming compared to national average are people like Gypsy and Roma traveler groups, Black Caribbean kids, whereas kids in particular from Chinese and Indian backgrounds are performing very well within the English system. Again, that allows us to say a little bit about where should we target efforts to reduce gaps in attainment. Again, there are some issues with that, which I'll come to in a moment. Finally, we can also, of course, look at regional differences, and I'm aware that that is one of the things that is a big issue within the Italian system as well. But we can look, for example, at where the disadvantage gap is greater or smaller. And you can see that here in this table, these are all the local authorities or the local districts in England, and they have been categorized by how big the gap is in attainment between the most and least disadvantaged pupils, and there are quite big differences. So you see here that in some areas, the difference between the advantage and disadvantage is almost 2 years of learning. And Blackpool and Knowsley are both areas in the northwest of England. Plymouth is in the southwest, whereas Westminster in London, the gap is less than 1 month. That's a big difference. And again, there are policy lessons to be taken from that. What is happening in Westminster and in London more generally, that means those gaps are much smaller than in other parts of the country, and what can we learn from that? So again, useful policy information for us, very useful to get. You may ask, okay, so what is the reason for that? There are many possible explanations. One of the explanations is that there was a big program called the London Challenge, in which investment was made in the early 2000s into the city of London. Schools were made to collaborate together to address disadvantage and so on, and that seems to have had a positive effect. But also there are specific differences in the demographic characteristics of London, which is a much more multicultural city than places like Blackpool and Knowsley. And as we will see in a moment, that has an impact in terms of the attainment of children in England. Now, so my first take-home message is it is really useful to have this type of national data for policy making. And if you do not have a system of national testing, then it is certainly useful to encourage the use of surveys, etc., to try and collect as much data as you can. However, there are, as with everything, also certain disadvantages and certain unintended consequences that we see as well. And there are kind of 3 things that I want to highlight here. The unintended consequences of political scrutiny, the interpretation of data, and the question of what data is actually missing from those national systems that is important. So to start with this issue of political scrutiny, of course, once you have this type of data, policymakers will look at it, will interrogate it. And that can lead to particular pressures. So one of the things that I said earlier that data is useful to look at is the performance of the education system over time. And here we have the performance of the English education system between 1988 and I'm going to look at the period up to 2010. And here we have the percentage of pupils getting what is known as a good pass grade on the GCSE examinations. Those are the examinations taken at the age of 16. In the English system, a grade between an A star and a C is a good passing grade, a good grade. Now, you can see in the first graph here at the top is that between 1988 and 2010, we see an increase in the pupils getting those top grades from 8.4% to 22.6%. Moreover, we see that that percentage increases every single year. There is not a year between 1988 and 2010 that we do not see an increase in those proportions. You can see a little bit of a change there in 1994 because then the A grade was split up into A star and A. But every year we see those top grades increasing up into actually 2011. What is going on here? There are a couple of explanations for that. One is that this continuous improvement reflects a massive improvement of the English education system. That would be really great. If that is true, then we have one of the best school improvement projects in the history of world education. We would have everybody come to England to say, how have you managed to improve your education system every year from 1988 to 2011? That's amazing. However, this is not really happening, and that's not surprising because when you look at some other data, for example, the tests of PISA and the tests of TIMSS, you do not see that the performance of English pupils improves every year. It is at best stable. Another possibility, are English children getting more intelligent every year? Well, that also seems a little bit unlikely. That's a relatively stable characteristic. And again, we would expect to see that also then in the international tests. So what's happened here? Because in policy, there was a tendency to want to make sure that every year the Minister of Education can say, our system is getting better. Look, more children are getting higher grades. So there was a pressure for what we call grade inflation. So a pressure to make the test just a little bit easier every year so that more and more pupils get those higher grades. And that's something that you see quite often if you have high stakes assessment systems. We see that, for example, in England, also now in universities. Every year, more pupils get the highest grades in universities as well. So that means that actually when we try to use this data to compare change over time, it is not so useful because we are actually seeing a political phenomenon rather than an educational phenomenon. Now, what you can see in the beginning of, at the end of this graph is that in 2012, we see that the improvement stops. And every year since then, we see not so much improvement anymore, but stability. Why is that? Is that because the education system is stagnated? No, it's simply because in 2010, the then Minister of Education decided that the data was no longer credible. It is not credible that we improve every year. So said, okay, I'm going to make the exam regulator ensure that we have the same percentage of passes at the highest level every year. So that's now what happens. So political decisions influence that data. So we need to understand what those kind of political decisions are and how they influence things as well. So that's one issue around the policy use of data and the policy influence sometimes on data. Second thing is around this issue of understanding data and what it means. Now, a couple of slides ago, I showed you some data on the performance of different ethnic groups in the English education system. Now, the conclusion from that would be that, in particular, some ethnic minority groups do less well in the English education system than white British pupils. However, when you analyze that data a little bit further and also take into account the social class of pupils, as my colleague Steve Strand has done in the paper I am citing here, you can actually see that the picture is a lot more complicated. It is actually, and you can see that in the left hand bar of the chart here, the white British pupils who are socio-economically disadvantaged, who are the lowest performing in the English education system. That's quite unique. We are the only country in Europe where it is indeed the indigenous disadvantaged population which is the lowest performing. But obviously that is important to know, and we would lose that information if we did not understand the interaction between the different variables. So again, it's about educating policymakers about those kind of subtleties in the data, which are sometimes not understood. And finally, I was going to say a little bit about things that are missing. So again, here in this table, we are using as a proxy for social class, and Steve Strand calls it social class, this measure of free school meal eligibility. So are my parents poor enough so that I will get the free lunch in the school? And as I said earlier, that is a relatively weak proxy measure of social background. We don't have a good measure of social background in the English system. That's missing. So remember what variables we do not have. So that's a little bit about using the kind of national data for policy. And that is obviously a growing area as more and more countries collect more and more data. The second area of data use for policy is the use of large-scale international assessment data. And again, that is something that has obviously been increasingly influential internationally through, in particular, the PISA tests, to a lesser extent, the TIMSS tests and the TALIS tests. But they have had a massive impact in a lot of countries in terms of national policies. Now, of course, as you will know, those are quite extensive studies. They actually collect a range of different data. PISA, for example, collects a range of questionnaires about what happens in classroom. TALIS collects questions about leadership, etc. TIMSS also has in the past used video studies. TALIS now also is using a video study of observing classrooms. But what you actually see is that the data that is most commonly used in policy are just the country league tables. So who is highest on PISA, who is improving on PISA, and so on. So that is what policymakers use. The data on what happens in classrooms, that has been used in educational research, but not so frequently in policy making. And that is unfortunate, because what that means is that instead of looking at what the data is actually telling us necessarily about systems that appear to do well, we instead see policymakers, ministers going on visits to countries that score highly and just taking things from that which they think are useful. Now, large-scale international data is incredibly useful, and I'm going to talk a bit more about why that is, but there are also some issues in terms of how that is used in policymaking. So some things that we have seen across countries, for example, is that this policy borrowing, and you see here the Finnish flag. Of course, Finland has been a very popular country to look at, did well, a bit less well in the most recent studies, but did very well in some earlier PISA studies. Singapore, another country, Singapore maths. In England, we had the Minister of Education going to Singapore to see how they do maths. We imported some teachers from Singapore and from Shanghai to teach in English schools to show us how it is done and so on. In Germany, you had the big PISA shock when a decade ago or so, Germany took part and found that their education system was doing a lot less well than they were expecting, and that led kind of to a large-scale program of educational reform in Germany. So you can see that influence being very strong, and some people make a career of being the Finland person, being the Singapore person, etc. However, we have to be a little bit careful with this policy borrowing, because things are not always what they seem. I have two pictures on this slide to illustrate that a little bit. The top hand picture is a picture of a classroom in Finland. And this may surprise you a little bit, because when we see a lot of the rhetoric and literature about Finland, it's always about the kind of progressive methods they use, the innovative classrooms, etc. But when you look at the kind of education that pupils who actually did well in the PISA tests have had, it's actually quite a traditional form of schooling, whole class teaching, quite a strict curriculum, etc. And that is not always understood. The reforms to Finnish education actually come after the pupils who do well in the PISA tests have done those tests. So be careful in terms of just interpreting what those countries are doing. The second picture is a picture from Singapore. And it is a picture of a bookshop. And why do I have a picture of a bookshop? That is, if you were able to like zoom in on the first couple of displays of books, you will see that almost all those books are test preparation booklets. I went to Singapore as guest of the ministry a number of years ago, and we went to some schools in the suburbs of Singapore, and we went to a shopping center, and they took me to a bookshop, and half the bookshop is just full of test preparation books that parents buy for their children from year zero. You have test preparation for babies up to university level. So again, what is causing the high performance of Singapore? Is it the education system, or is it the fact that they are very good at doing tests because they are doing tests all the time, also at home? So those are the kind of questions we need to ask ourselves when we look at that data. This is very much not to say that that data is not useful for policy. It is very useful for policy. Firstly, because it is the only large-scale international data we have, and that international data is very helpful. It tells us a lot about where we stand as a system, what kind of things are common to international systems, what are different. Interesting and sometimes underestimated data set, I think, is the TALIS one, where we learn a lot about the characteristics of the school workforce, which differs quite a lot between countries. So to give you an example, English teachers are very young compared to other countries. The international assessments are also actually very well designed, very carefully constructed. As mentioned in the introduction, I was part of the group who did the latest TALIS survey. Well, that's a big project, internationally piloted and validated. A lot of statistical experts involved in it. So well-designed studies, I would say. Also, actually a good range of variables in those studies, a lot more than just those assessments that you make the league tables from. So there's a lot of useful analysis that you can do on that. And of course, again, it allows us to see changes over time. Are particular systems improving? Is the equity in particular systems improving? And again, that is particularly useful for policy. It allows us to highlight, for example, where we have growing inequality in our education system. So massively useful for policy. However, we do often in policy come to quickly two conclusions from those data sets. I mentioned earlier already this issue around what can we and cannot we learn from different countries? What context do we need to understand? So, for example, the context of wide-scale test preparation in Singapore, for example. But there are also issues of measurement. When you look at doing an assessment that is international, there are a lot of decisions you have to take around what items you are going to put in your test. If you are going to test, for example, reading, it is not a simple matter to find items that work in English, in Italian, in Finnish, in Chinese, and so on and so on. This is a very complex thing. By definition, your instrument has to be somewhat limited in length. Always there are questions as to what is in there, what is not in there. Are particular items working better in some countries than others, and so on. That links to the next issue of measurement invariance, which is, of course, another massive question with international studies. Are our measures really invariant across the many different countries? So if you look at something like TALIS, is a measure of school culture really the same in South Korea as it is in France? A very different context, very different way of looking at those things. And of course, we do a lot of statistical analysis to ascertain measurement invariance, but it is very much imperfect. If you look at the statistics from those international tests, especially where you get the survey questionnaires, measurement invariance is not great in many cases. Third thing is differences in the sample. I'm going to look at that a little bit in more detail, but actually, if you look at, say, PISA test, and you look at, okay, we're going to sample all 15-year-olds, who are in school, what that means is quite different from one country to the next. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. What do you look at? What things do you measure? What, for example, is the content of mathematics that you want to look at in different countries? Again, one of the challenges there is that countries have different curricula, so they do different things at different times. So if you look at, say, mathematics, in England, maybe we do statistical significance for the first time in the 4th year of primary schools. In Belgium, we usually do that in the beginning of secondary school. So do we add items on that to the test or not for the particular age groups? And that approach also changed a bit over time. We try to make the tests invariant over time, but items do have to change. So again, there is some variance there. And then also you can see that tests are influenced by differences in educational views. If you look, for example, at the content of the PISA test in maths and the content of the TIMSS test in maths, they reflect slightly different perspectives on the subject. So TIMSS tends to be more content oriented, and PISA tends to be more skills, TIMSS more knowledge, and PISA a bit more skills oriented. So again, that is going to impact to an extent how well countries do. So this issue of who is actually in the tests is more important than we often think it is. This is the percentage of 15-year-olds in the education system actually covered by PISA. And remember, there are a couple of things that determine whether or not they are covered. A, are they in school or not? And B, how does a country deal with pupils with special educational needs? Are they excluded from the test or are they in the tests? And you can see that that leads to quite a lot of differences. And how that impacts is quite important. So one of the things that we have seen in the most recent PISA test is very good performance from Vietnam. And a lot of people have been saying, oh, there's a Vietnam education miracle, we need to know what Vietnam does. But when you look at this index of coverage, you can actually see that Vietnam is towards the bottom in the right-hand column. Only around 70% of the population of 15-year-olds is included in the PISA, is covered by the PISA test. Why is that? Because in the Vietnamese system, a lot of children go out of education, go out of schooling before they are 15-year-olds. And of course, that is not a random group of people. Those are most commonly the most socioeconomically disadvantaged pupils. So when you look at that 70% of pupils who are covered in Vietnam, and you compare that to the almost 100% who are covered in Germany, it is fair to say that the sample in Vietnam will be more socioeconomically advantaged and therefore probably higher performing than the sample in Germany. So that is important to take into account. Just very recently, another colleague of mine, John Jerrin, published an article looking at Canada. And Canada, again, is one of those countries that has been put forward as a bit of an educational miracle. How well have they done? But again, they have a relatively low coverage because they exclude most of the pupils with special educational needs from the testing population. And that significantly impacts their position in those league tables. So again, we need to understand a little bit some of those backgrounds when we make the comparisons, and that's also to do with things like how do we define a year group. Different starting ages in education is also, of course, an interesting one. In England, we start particularly early with formal schooling. They go to primary school when they are only 5 years old. In most countries, that is 6, in some 7. Interestingly, that does not mean that we do any better in international tests than countries which start later. National curriculum may be more or less aligned to what is tested in, say, PISA. As I mentioned, different countries have more or less emphasis on testing in their national systems. And of course, there are different values as well. So again, international tests, very, very useful, but we need to be quite cautious about how we interpret them. Final thing I'm going to talk a little bit about, and of course, coming from Ofsted, the national inspection in England, this is a topic I have had to look at quite a lot, is using data for accountability purposes. So for judging the performance of schools or teachers and so on. And that will be the last 10 minutes of my presentation. So accountability takes different forms. And again, we see quite a lot of differences between countries in how that happens. So we have forms of professional accountability, which is where we kind of leave it to the profession, to schools, to teachers to hold themselves to account. So for things like peer review, where schools will look at each other's performance, or for professional standards that we expect teachers to adhere to. We have hierarchical accountability, where essentially government sets up a framework which schools are judged by, and typically in most countries we have national inspectorates, inspection systems which do that, which go into schools and hold them accountable according to those particular standards. We have public accountability, where we attempt to make the schools accountable to their community or to the broader public, for example, including parents in the governance of schools. And we have market accountability, where we have a competitive system. And in England, for example, we have school choice and published school exam results that allow parents to say, okay, this school is doing better, so I will send my children there. Most countries have different blends. A country like Finland tends to go for a more professional and public accountability framework. In England, we have hierarchical and market accountability, but most have a blend. And in many countries, attainment data are a part of that accountability. For example, in England, but also in most parts of the United States, the attainment data is published at a school level. So every school, we can look online at the percentage of pupils getting good grades in every school in the country. Governments often use that data to hold schools accountable. They will do things like, in England, they can, and in America as well, they can close a school if it doesn't perform well enough, and so on. So how useful is that? There is not so much research on the use of data for accountability purposes. As Burgess says, lack of rigorous data makes it hard to draw conclusions, but there are some studies. So Burgess did a comparison of England and Wales, because what happened is that in Wales, they stopped publishing the attainment data for schools, and in England, they continued to publish it. So you could compare the performance of schools before and after that change in policy. And Burgess did find that once the Welsh schools stopped publishing the data, their results got worse. In the US, again, they find overall relatively positive impact, small impact, positive impact of using data attainment to hold schools accountable and publishing that. So those findings suggest a small positive impact of doing this, but there is also other data. There are many unintended consequences to using attainment data for accountability. There is clear evidence that it leads to greater teacher stress and lower teacher well-being. And of course, that's an issue because we know in many countries we have a problem with recruiting teachers. We have a shortage of teachers. So if we make them more stressed, that is going to exacerbate that problem. We also know that different models of accountability can lead to different conclusions. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second. We see, and we've certainly seen that in England, that if you hold schools accountable for the attainment of their pupils, what they then do is they start teaching to the test. So their curriculum is all about what are pupils being tested on. And for example, in primary schools, we saw that because children are tested in English and in mathematics, the other subjects are not given much attention in many schools. So that's one of the problems there. And in some cases, schools and education systems try to cheat the tests. So there were in America some big scandals in Atlanta, in Georgia, and in Washington, DC, where school superintendents actually did things like opening the tests before the actual testing date, so they knew the questions and things like that. So cheating happens, and that's obviously a big problem as well. A little bit more about the difference in different models. So you have different ways in which you can hold schools to account with attainment. You can just give the raw percentage, so what percentage of pupils have a good grade. That, of course, is massively problematic because we know that what you then get is mainly a ranking of the intake of the schools. So which schools has the least disadvantaged pupils, they will tend to do best in the test. So therefore, we use often value-added models where we control for the prior attainment of the pupils, or we use contextual value-added models where we control for prior attainment, but also for levels of poverty, ethnicity, gender, and so on. Now, the problem is that what model you use influences your results. So here we have a table looking at two different value-added models. Researcher called Mike Treadaway calculated this, and how value-added scores change for schools with the lowest and highest free school meal eligibility rate. Remember that free school meal eligibility rate is whether or not parents are poor enough so that their pupils qualify for a free lunch. And you can see if you have just value added, so you only correct for prior attainment, you see that schools with less disadvantaged pupils do better. If you also correct for things like social background and ethnicity, schools with higher levels of disadvantage do better. So what variables you put in your model is going to influence the ranking of the schools in those systems. So that means you have to make a lot of decisions about that as well. That also affects what schools do. So to give you an example of that, in from around 2000 to 2010 in the English system, we used a contextual value added model where we had we controlled attainment for private attainment, free school meal eligibility, ethnicity, but also special educational needs. Now, what schools quickly discovered is that special educational needs was a very influential variable on their scores. And how do you determine whether a kid has special educational needs in the English system? Well, the school can determine that themselves. So what we see is that we see a very big increase in the number of pupils identified with special educational needs, because the more you have, the more that influences your contextual value added model and the better you seem to be doing. So again, we need to think carefully about the unintended consequences of the statistical models we use for accountability. Again, another thing, of course, to remember is the always forgotten issue of confidence intervals in value added models. So what we tend to look at is the blue points, the point estimates for the schools. But of course, we know that when we have a statistical model, there is a great degree of uncertainty. There's often a big confidence interval. And therefore, what we often see is that the real picture looks like this. So it becomes quite hard to actually distinguish the value added performance of different schools. Interestingly, PISA suggests that there's a relationship between autonomy and accountability. So they specifically see a relationship between the effectiveness of attainment-based accountability and the national policies in relation to the autonomy of schools. So they are saying that in countries where there is more autonomy for the school, accountability by attainment has a positive effect. Where there is less autonomy, it has a negative effect. That's only from one PISA study, so we have to be a little bit careful about those findings, but it is an interesting thing to look at. So I am at the end of my time, so just some broad conclusions. What I've tried to say here is that data is an incredibly useful and essential part of good decision making in policy and in accountability, but we have to be careful about naive use and naive understanding of data, and that's obviously a challenge because policymakers do not necessarily have a good data literacy, and therefore a task for us is to try and nuance and develop that contextual understanding amongst users. That's all from me today. I think we then have some time for questions.
Daniel, thanks. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. We go right away. We are slightly late, so we go right away to the floor for questions. Please write down on the chat if you have questions.
Yeah. You want to ask me the questions, or?
Well, if others don't, I mean, again, I've got two questions. Well, being a kind of a highly dependent INVALSI data user, we use INVALSI data a lot to look at regional differences. And I've seen you had a couple of slides on that. So how much research there is at Ofsted and more in general in England, looking at not just social class differences or migratory background differences, but interacting that with regional differentiation. Again, it's one slide you showed was quite clear. This is like the more specific question. Then there are a lot of other things you said are very interesting. The second question, I think, is naive, unfortunately, and it just requires me few seconds to introduce it. Okay, I do also research on income inequality. And for comparative research, there is one beautiful thing, which is the Luxembourg income study. What they do there, they look at national surveys on income and households' income. They do a huge work on homogenizing the data in order to have a relatively homogeneous, comparable data set on national surveys. So it's not an international survey. So it's not EU-Silk or anything else. So listening to you, and I mean, and they started like 30 years ago with a very small group of Western European countries, and then increasingly they grew. Do you think, and that's a question for you, but also for Patricia and the others from INVALSI, that we could try to start to have some sort of a harmonization, at least in some of the data our national research institutes collect, in order partially to avoid some of the limitations we would have, for instance, with PISA data or OECD data? I mean, for me as a researcher, it would be already important to find a way to compare your data with data on Italy and another couple of European countries. Then if we have the US, we hit the jackpot, fine. But you think we could start, I know it's partially naive, to start thinking on a small group of countries, building up a group, trying to figure out if in a way or another we can make more easily comparable, not to get homogeneity perhaps, but the different national, very rich data sets we have. There is going to be no TALIS, no PISA, no international program that can provide us so many information as the national data sets from Ofsted, INVALSI, and others can do. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll address your first question first then, which is what about the interaction between social class, migration background and regional data? Yes, I mean, that is certainly something that we have in the data in England that has been looked at as well. One of the things that we find there, for example, is when you look at those areas where you have the biggest attainment gaps, they are characterized by a demographic that is predominantly white and working class. So this is, and when you look at an area like London, that is characterized by a demographic that is largely migrant background and very mixed in terms of social class. So this is, of course, important, and this does explain some of the regional differences that we find. Those regional differences are therefore a little bit different from what you find in many countries. So where you typically find that where you have more kids from migrant backgrounds, they tend to do worse. But also they are quite strongly related to other societal factors. So for example, you see that those areas where you have you have big gaps, low attainments, high levels of white working class kids, they are also the areas that typically vote for Brexit in the EU referendum. So yes, that's so interesting, but also interesting to look at that data in broader societal context. Second question is a really, really interesting question as well. To what extent can we try to create homogeneous data sets from the different national data sets looking at different countries? I think that that's a really valuable thing to look at, and I would definitely encourage that endeavor to start, and for a group of interested countries to start to look at that. It is, of course, really quite complex because the metrics are less standardized than a metric of income, of course. So that's the challenge. The challenge is, okay, if you look at the attainment data, different testing systems, if you look at the data on demographics, different ways of collecting socioeconomic data. So one thing, of course, there as well is to what extent can we encourage countries to try and standardize a little bit more that collection of data. So for example, that we would all use something like, I don't know, International Labour Organization classifications of occupations and things like that, rather than going down different routes. So, I mean, I would say, yes, absolutely, we want to do that, but we will find that it is a complex and depth. And I don't know whether Patricia wants to come in there as well with some comments from a point of view of INVALSI.
Yeah, we can start the collaboration to study this aspect.
Very good. I mean, as a user, I would be very happy. So thanks for your answer, Daniel, and thanks to Patricia. There is on the chat a message from Rosella. Please, Rosella. I mean, it's so long that I rather give you the floor and ask you to say directly. Otherwise, it's going to take me longer to read the whole thing. Rosella Garuti. Patricia, can people open up their microphones and intervene directly, or they're all muted by default?
Rosella, maybe you should to open the microphone if you want to. Ross?
Perhaps there are problems with connections.
Otherwise, I'm happy to read this.
Yeah, please. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, Daniel.
So Rosella says that on the disadvantages of international evaluations, the problem of PISA influencing the educational choices of the countries is not a problem of PISA, but of cultural weaknesses with regards to educational choices. Rosella says that the countries need to take the important information that PISA gives, but also need to make their own cultural choices around, say, traditions regarding mathematics, for example, in dialogue with the PISA results. So the problem is not necessarily PISA's, but that of the individual countries which must choose which indications to give in order to maintain their cultural choices and traditions. I would not like to see mathematics teaching in Italy PISA defined. What do you think? So I agree. I think indeed that what we don't want to see happening is that we create a homogenized international curriculum based on PISA tests. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the PISA test is based on a set of decisions about what curriculum in that area needs to look like. Is that the best curriculum for your context, for your country? Not necessarily. So I do support the view that you need to look at, we need to look at international tests, but also as other education systems in light of your own culture and your own traditions. And similarly, you can't just say, oh, let's import what they do in Singapore to Italy or what they do in Finland to Italy. Context is different, culture is different. One thing, for example, we say always about Finland is one of the advantages that they have is that the job of teacher is very highly valued. Well, you can say, wouldn't it be great if we can just import that? But you can't just import that. You cannot just import the culture of high value of teachers to a context where that is not the case. That is a long and arduous journey of cultural change.
Thank you very much, Daniel. There is, I think, then we have to pass on Tommaso, but a last question from Christina, which I totally share. Both of us are very interested and fond of early childhood education. So you said that, as you can read in the chart, how to measure early years education and how do you use that and so on. So for instance, that was a question I was very interested into. Do you plan, or have you started also to check some measurements for nurseries? So even before kindergarten, because there is a huge discussion on, does it make sense to do this type of measures when you go to kindergarten? Even more for nurseries, there are attempts to measure these things. So following on Christina and thanking Christina for the question, what do you think about measurements before primary school?
Okay, so two things to say there. First, I'll say a little bit about how it is currently done, but also what the plans are of the English Education Ministry in that. So the way they do that at the moment is they use observation by the adults in the setting based on a framework called the Early Years Foundation Stage and the Early Learning Goals. So the adults, teacher, whatever, will assess each of their individual pupils through observation as to how far they have developed in terms of those goals. Now, of course, how reliable is that as a measure? That's there are questions to be asked about that. And as a result of that, the English government decided to do what they call baseline testing when the pupils are 5 years of age, and they have been busy piloting that, but because of the coronavirus pandemic, that's sort of slowed down now. But of course, that is very controversial because we know that reliably testing pupils, and they were thinking of doing that on iPads or something like that, at that age is really problematic, and you see that it is very hard to develop a reliable test. So I am curious to see what will come out of that and how reliable and valid that will actually be. I do think testing before primary school is quite problematic.
Daniel, thanks. Thanks for your very insightful and presentation and interesting presentation. If there are no further questions, we thank you again, and we shift and we pass the floor to Tommaso for his presentation.